Hello my dear friends and family, I'm Operator Starsky with new updates on Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine. Ukrainian defenders successfully knocked out a few more Russian key oil refineries. Kremlin is going absolutely crazy because of Tomahawk missiles, but keeps claiming they won't change anything. Strange, right? Belarus is testing its troops, Russia is testing Estonian and French patients, ISW makes forecasts on the possible upcoming Russian invasion of Europe, and Russian losers record their failures on the video in our traditional section of magnificent Russian cringe. My dear friends, this is the Frontline Focus. Let's roll. First off, a major blow in the Russia-occupied Crimean city of Feodosia, where Ukrainian drones struck the massive oil terminal, hitting at least 5 fuel tanks and sparking a large fire. Several strikes were recorded over the week, with the most recent one taking place literally tonight. This facility is the largest oil storage hub in Crimea, and it also supports Russian invaders. The Russian terrorists looked completely helpless trying to defend this strategic object, and their air defenses effectively failed to stop Ukrainian missiles and long-range drones from reaching their target. This strike also damaged several power substations, which shows that it was not only about fuel but also about energy and logistics disruption. So my friends, I think the message is clear. Ukraine is showing that even what Russia considered safe in Crimea might not be so safe after all. And considering the fact that currently there is this big nasty fuel crisis taking over Russia, you might probably understand why Putin looks even tinier and older than usual. Apparently it's because he tries to shrink to pop out from this dimension completely, but it doesn't work this way. Because you cannot become too small for The Hague to stop hunting you for your crimes. Meanwhile, in the Russian interior, the Bashkortostan region, about 1400 kilometers from Ukraine, was also hit. The good Ukrainian drones struck a key Russian oil refinery in the city of Ufa. This refinery is run by Bashneft, and it is a major Russian fuel processing site. A column of smoke was seen after explosion at the facility, and I think even the worst of the Russian Z-patriots and Z-generates slowly start to realize that even without American Tomahawks, no place in the terrorist federation is truly out of reach. And last but not least, the border region of Belgorod in Russia saw another portion of fireworks generously delivered by good Ukrainian drones and missiles. A heating power station, Luch, decided to join the popular Russian trend and stopped working due to several impacts. Earlier there was another strike setting fire at the power generation facilities, but the Russian regional governor told his citizens that basically it was just a pile of trash burning and there was nothing to worry about. And honestly, he didn't even lie, because that junk from the Soviet era probably remembers the day Stalin was too young to grow a mustache and Lenin still had hair. In addition to that, the Belgorod regional governor warned his happy citizens about the upcoming power cuts in the oblast. You know, I never tried hamsters, but a couple years ago I remember I saw that funny Russian advertisement showing freezing Ukrainians sitting in the darkness and eating a hamster soup. I think, that this winter Russians should really consider using their own advice, and if the hamsters taste bad, please blame Putin. Now let's dig into the situation on the front, where mighty Russian army on its way to Berlin and Paris accidentally stumbled upon a tiny Ukrainian town of Pokrovsk. First of all, we can see that Russia's offensive attempts keep stalling. The invaders are still trying to push on multiple axes, specifically in the eastern Ukraine, around the Donetsk, Luhansk and Kharkiv areas, which remains Putin's main effort. Yet, despite repeated attempts, the progress is extremely limited. I think every conscious and sober military expert nowadays, if it's not Douglas MacGregor, of course, notices that Russian advances are very much incremental and costly and failing to achieve major operational breakthroughs. And it doesn't matter what the Russians are trying to throw at Ukrainian positions, it just doesn't work. What this tells us, even though Russia is constantly attacking, the big wins they hoped for are not materializing, and frankly, they only exist in Putin's imagination. At the same time, we can see that the terrorist federation is pushing to establish buffer zones, particularly in northern Ukraine. We're talking Sumy, Kharkiv, and also Belgorod direction. Basically, they're doing it to prevent Ukrainian advances or to protect Russian territories from long-range strikes. However, with the reach of Ukrainians' long-range weapons, I think Russians better start those buffer zones somewhere on the outskirts of Bashkortostan. So despite the obvious evidence indicating that these efforts of establishing buffer zones persist, but they are facing strong resistance and are expensive to maintain for the Russian terrorists. What the Russian command is busy with nowadays is basically redeploying units and changing tactics. For example, they're moving drone operators and Russia's so-called elite units among different sectors, attempting to plug holes. But despite that, their operational momentum appears extremely weak. At this point, Russia is relying more on things like artillery, attrition tactics, raids, long-range strikes, and less on actual deep maneuvers. All this indicates that the war of attrition is much harder for Putin and his minions than they expected. And while Russia is under pressure, Ukraine is not just standing still. The Ukrainian defenders are launching strikes into Russian-occupied areas and making Russia pay for every single meter. Ukraine's ability to keep Russia from sweeping through large territory is basically a major theme because, again, this is something a lot of experts fail to understand, but Ukraine has effectively stopped Russian troops and the terrorist federation is unable to show even the same results as in 2024 when the front line was practically stationary. However, despite the good news, the fact is Russia's failure to reach its primary goals in Ukraine means that the war is likely to continue. For example, for Europe and for any neighbor watching Russia, this means that the risk of escalation remains, but also that Russia's dominance seems unlikely. Of course, unless Putin's friends in Europe and in the United States somehow manage to help. At the same time, Kremlin also understands this situation. On 11th of October, the Institute for the Study of War published its report suggesting that Russia is actually preparing to not just stop in Ukraine, but also push through Europe. The report points out that Russia's defense industry is ramping up its production of tanks, specifically the T-90 tank line, and refurbishing older tanks like the T-72, trying to rebuild its armored reserves that were obliterated in Ukraine. The ISW report emphasizes that Russia is preparing for the long term, not just short war in Ukraine. And generally it's hard to call it short because it already lasts almost as long as Russia's so-called Great Patriotic War of 1941-1945. I think only about 3 months shorter as of today. And crucially, the report mentions that Russia's desire to build those buffer zones is actually part of the reasoning why they might look beyond Ukraine's borders towards European countries. And although it doesn't say invasion of Europe tomorrow, but you can basically read it between the lines. Because Russia is rebuilding its armor and reserves, it may possibly choose to launch major operations later, not only in Ukraine. That's one assumption that we should always keep in mind, my friends. Also add to that the recent drone incursions all over the Europe, which were not only meant to make you nervous, but also collect intelligence. The limited success so far in Ukraine means that Russia might actually look for alternative axes of advance or ways to stretch its opponents, and Europe, being relatively less contested compared to Ukraine, might appear as a tempting target for Kremlin. But the report also suggests that Russia is not yet well positioned for a full-scale push into Europe. They're still tied down, bleeding resources, and facing strong resistance from the Ukrainian defenders. So the possibility is still there, but the timing and scale are completely uncertain. For Europe, this means being alert and supporting Ukraine as much as possible, so the war doesn't spread towards Poland, Germany, France, or any other country. To me personally, this report is a reminder that the war in Ukraine is not isolated, and I really hope that it will be a good reminder for other people around Europe as well. Russia is working on improving its long-term capabilities. It keeps expanding its military bases along the European borders, stockpiling weaponry, and though they're not storming into Europe tomorrow, the fact is they are preparing. And I also think that people in Europe should really take basic safety very, very seriously, because the terrorist federation is very hungry, it's ambitious, and it's very cruel, while we usually tend not to think about such scary things as war coming to our homes. Basically like Ukrainians in 2021. And while Ukraine keeps discussing the possibility of receiving Tomahawk missiles from the United States, Putin ordered all of his spokesmen to ramp up the nuclear hysteria in the media, apparently targeting Joe Rogan on the first place. From top Russian propagandist Solovyov openly calling for the full-scale invasion of Europe on the Russian national television, to Peskov, who, following Putin, hints Russia's nuclear response in case US won't let Russia kill Ukrainians. In his recent interview, Peskov even mentioned that old dusty Russian fake about Ukrainian dirty bomb. I think he even chuckled himself a bit while mentioning this one. But generally in his speech he provided people like Joe Rogan with more reasons to scream about the Russian nuclear apocalypse, which according to Russians themselves should have already started after first American HIMARS crossed Ukraine's border in 2022. And of course we've also heard the same in 2023, 24, 25, and we will be hearing this because the KGB handbook specifically says if you are weak, act as if you're a toughest bully in the pub. Guys, Russia has the largest nuclear stockpile in the world. At the same time, they're spending just a fraction of what the US, for example, are spending on their nuclear arsenal in order to upkeep it. Additionally, Kremlin will never nuke European or American cities because it doesn't want to kill their own kids and wives of the Russian oligarchs who live, study, and work in those countries. And basically that is why they will keep rattling their sabers and balalaikas, sending their submarines to the French coast or their little green men to the European borders. For example, this Saturday, Estonian border guards have closed their border not far from the Russian Pskov when a bunch of Russian green men were suddenly observed on the opposite side. And knowing just how friendly and reliable Russians are, Estonians decided to shut down part of the highway that is located on the Estonian territory, simply because it's much safer this way. Also yesterday, a Russian submarine all of a sudden surfaced not far from the French coast. Considering that this submarine carries cruise missiles, I highly doubt that it was just a malfunction, as they say. In my opinion, it was another attempt to make Europeans a bit more nervous. And simultaneously with that, Belarusian dictator Lukashenko decided to test his troops and launched a massive military exercise involving every branch of Belarusian army that still exists in that land. How dangerous is that for Europeans and specifically for Ukrainians? Well, we know that Russia effectively drained Belarusian stockpile of shells and weaponry, burning everything in Ukraine. And in the modern warfare, you cannot do much only using your manpower. Not even if your Spetsnaz builds the tallest human pyramids, which still looks entertaining, I admit. But if you want to see something even cooler, my dear friends, then please check out this amazing video that Russian terrorists recorded for you. They decided to showcase some expensive and highly sophisticated drone jammer, but things didn't go according to plan.
Парни, да, всем дронам, гляньте, какая у нас есть. О, но это еще не самое главное. А вот, видали такую хуйню? Сейчас пожжем все, блин.
2 minutes later.
Все, нет у нас больше рыба дорогого. И тачка. А так все хорошо.
You know, I simply love it when Ukrainian drones suddenly arrive and give Russians a very, very good reality check, because there is a real life beyond the Russian disinformation. And the dudes were so excited while installing that stuff. I really don't know how much money their relatives spent on that thing. But at the same time, you know, I don't see much Russian civilians funding, for example, renovation of the Russian schools or Russian hospitals as much as they fund the war of their own dictator using their very own money. And all that literally to make us laugh, which is kinda sad, but at the same time, sadness is what they deserve. With that, my dear friends and family, I wish you a beautiful day. Don't forget to subscribe to stay informed about the most important updates, and also share this content to help Ukraine be heard. I'll see you in the comments. I'm Operator Starsky. As always, be safe.
Subscribe to UATV English and stay updated on the most important events, top news from Ukraine and all over the world, in-depth analysis, exclusive reports and interviews, all on hand in our channel. Join our community of viewers and stay tuned.